Welcome to a Rice University podcast. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a gray afternoon to hear a great talk. I'm really glad to welcome you here to this afternoon's Scientia lecture, which marks the midway point through our series this year on networks. One of the important insights that our Bachner lecturer last month provided in his work was the power law distribution of networks, or the so-called 80-20 law, where 80% of the network nodes are small and poorly connected and 20% are superconnected. Today's lecturer is particularly dear to my heart because in the historical setup of universities globally, I have worked for a long time in Africa, which is among the 80% of poorly connected nodes within the networks of knowledge. And our speaker today is working very hard to level that playing field and totally change that equation by increasing access to knowledge by a lot of formerly poorly connected institutions and peoples. Rich Baraniuk received his PhD in electrical engineering from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. After a brief postdoctoral sojourn in France, he joined the faculty at Rice in 1993. His research interests lie in the areas of signal and image processing, including compressed sensing, sensor networks, and pattern recognition and learning. His research has been funded by an impressive set of acronyms. Among the ones we will all likely recognize are NSF, DARPA, DOE, EPA, and NATO. He's been a phenomenally productive researcher with over 200 conference publications and 100 journal and book chapter publications to his name. He has been a guest editor of special issues for the IEEE Signal Processing magazine on signal processing networks in 2002 and compressive sampling in 2008, and for the proceedings of the IEEE on educational technology in 2008. Dr. Baraniuk has also been the recipient of numerous honors for his research, including the National Young Investigator Award from the National Science Foundation in 1994, a Young Investigator Award from the Office of Naval Research in 1995, and the Rosenbaum Fellowship from the Isaac Newton Institute of Cambridge University in 1998. His work with Kevin Kelly on the Rice single-pixel compressive camera was selected by MIT Technology Review magazine as a top 10 emerging technology in 2007. In 1999, Dr. Baraniuk launched Connections, a non-profit publishing project that aims to bring textbooks and learning materials into the internet age. As he'll explain today, Connections makes high-quality educational content available to anyone, anywhere, anytime for free on the web and at very low cost in print by inviting authors, educators, and learners worldwide to create, rip, mix, and burn textbooks, courses, and learning materials from its global open access repository. Each month, Connections free materials from its Connections free educational materials are used by over 850,000 people from over 200 countries. Dr. Baraniuk's own signal processing materials in Connections have been viewed by maybe by over 4 million people, but at least 4 million times. Since 2002, Connections has been supported by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, NSF, Rice University, and several Friends of Rice. For his work on Connections, he received the Internet Pioneer Award from the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School in 2008, and the World Technology Award for Education in 2009. He was selected as one of Edutopia magazine's Daring Dozen Educators in 2007, and Connections received the Tech Museum Laureate Award from the Tech Museum of Innovation in 2006. To top off his many accomplishments, Dr. Baraniuk opened for Peter Gabriel at a 2006 TED Talk, an event that he identifies as possibly his career apogee. We can't aspire to top that honor today, but we are indeed delighted to have Rich Baraniuk here to talk about networks of knowledge. Rich.
Thank you. So it's great to be here today on a very Canadian kind of day to talk a little bit about how networks of communication networks are revolutionizing a number of different areas of academic discipline and academic discourse. This is not going to be a connections talk today. What I really want to do is try to broaden the idea and talk a bit about how technology is impinging on not just educational publishing, but also on scholarly publishing. All that being said, I'll also spend a little bit time talking about connections. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about what the message that I want to try and get across today, and sort of bracket the talk beginning and end with I think the really high points. The first is really a self-evident point, but it was really the driving idea behind Connections when we started the project over 10 years ago, and that is that knowledge truly does form a very densely interconnected network. And a lot of the work that goes on at institutions of higher learning and research is in fact disconnecting, right, this beautifully interconnected network. So we'll talk a lot about interconnection of ideas and knowledge and how it's better to less disconnect and more interconnect. The second, a little bit less obvious, is that different kinds of networks, namely communication networks, enable and are enabling fundamentally new means to both produce and exploit knowledge on all scales, from K-12 education for children up through the highest rank of scientific journals. So what I really want to do is talk both about knowledge networks from the perspective of interconnections of ideas and how it can be very, very powerful, both in a scholarly research approach and also in an educational pedagogical approach to try to connect ideas together, and also to talk about how communication networks, the internet, the web, are offering revolutionary new means to create and exploit knowledge. The kind of networks that I want to talk about in particular in this talk are what I call open networks of knowledge. And these are networks that are based on open standards, the same kind of open standards that are behind the internet, right? Namely well, we'll talk a lot about this in detail, but namely that people are free to gain access to these networks, they're free to interact with these networks, and they're free to contribute to these networks. And hopefully this will become more clear as we go through the rest of the talk. Just to give you sort of set a baseline, let's talk about something different. Let's talk about music. Right? Does anybody have any of these? Yeah. I know David has a big collection of Verve LPs in his attic. And let's talk about music. Does anybody like music? I think so, right? And what it is about music that has created a tremendously vibrant, interactive global community of not just musicians, but music consumers, right? People who listen to music every single day. I would argue, first of all, it's about technology. It's about earth flattening, digital technologies, especially things like iPods, things like iTunes. But it's also about a culture, right? It's about a culture that allows anyone in the world to create their own new musical ideas, share them with others in various ways, reuse musical ideas in all kinds of different ways, and reuse and fuse musical ideas in all kinds of different ways. And as a result of this, both technology and this community ethos, we have this incredibly vibrant, interactive, really with it now community of musicians and music consumers. And I don't think that we would ever use any of these adjectives on the right to describe the world of monographs, scholarly journals, and textbooks. Right? We would use instead words like stodgy, glacial, disconnected, right? Disconnected, and even ineffective, possibly. And so really, you can think of this world of trying to build true networks of knowledge is really to try to move from a world of closed educational ideas, because it truly is today's publishing system that is causing this breakdown, right? And by locking up knowledge and behind closed formats, again, technology, and behind closed copyrights, again, a community aspect, okay? So it's today's publishing system that is really doing this. And you can think of the idea of building these open networks of knowledge is really trying to move from this idea we have in our mind about music and openness and try to bring this to both scholarly work and educational pedagogical work. So that's really what I'd like to talk about for the rest of the day. So what are the enablers? Okay, the first enabler, right, we talked about is technology. Right? Changing from a paper-based world to an electronic world is very powerful. Okay, it's very powerful because we can have, thanks to the internet, right, virtually free distribution of scholarly ideas, scientific ideas, educational ideas, and basically at virtually infinite, virtually permanent storage of all of these ideas. Okay, this is a very, very important change from a resource-limited, paper-based publication system to a virtually resource, an internet-based, much less constrained publication system. Okay? The second is building on top of the internet, things like the web, using tools like XML, being able to modularize, take textbooks, right? Take journal articles, take journals themselves, and think of them not as the quanta being this, right? This is not the quantum, but the quantum being, right? Think of this being built from little atomic elements or Lego blocks that can be very efficiently used and reused and recombined in different ways, so that we can show not just how the different ideas in this book connect together, but also how they connect with the ideas in this scholarly journal, for example. Something that is just not very well elicited, right, in our standard paper-based publication systems. So here's an example of a network of knowledge. It doesn't look like much, right? It's in its primordial soup phase. It looks extremely chaotic, in fact, right? A little bit of art history down here on the left. There's some geometry and algebra. But the point is that these little Lego blocks are actually web objects. They're actually encapsulated in technology, which enable us to use things like database technologies, other technologies, to very rapidly pull these together into what you could even think of as a learning machine. Right? Replace the idea in your mind of a static textbook or journal with this idea of a rapidly buildable, reconfigurable learning machine. And not just this, a learning machine that's different for everyone. Right? So that when Sydney picks up his journal, right, to read, it's a different journal than David might pick up, because they are different people and they have different interests, they have different backgrounds and different affinities. Okay, we'll talk more about this at the very end, but it's very interesting that our educational system, with all of the technology that's been developed over the last decades, is still very much like walking into a store, buying a suit off the rack, and walking out with it. Right? We hand kids a textbook at the start of class, and there's almost no customization of the material to their individual needs and learning styles. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about this later. The second is, especially in the educational side of things, because this is not as much a problem in the scholarly publishing world, but especially in the educational publishing world, there's tremendous inefficiency from lack of reuse. We've written the same little tidbit on using L'Hopital's rule in calculus 85,000 times in 85,000 different books around the world. Why can't we write that really, really well, right? And then reuse it in a whole number of different contexts, so that maybe people can be thinking of truly the frontiers of knowledge rather than just re-explaining 85,000 times the same idea. So that's technology, right? That's, I think, very easy for everyone to understand and to think about. The second big element, though, is trying to translate this community idea of openness and open sharing and reuse of material into something that's actually legal. Okay? Because nobody's put up their hand when I was talking about music, and I said that everyone is free to reuse and create and share musical ideas. In fact, this is illegal, right? And if you do this, the RIAA will rapidly send you a letter, right, talking about how illegal this is. So what we need to be able to do is make scholarly ideas and educational ideas not just easy to share by technology, but also safe to share by putting them inside the right legal constructs. And something that's really developed over this last decade or so, that really in parallel with the open source software movement, people familiar with Linux software, for example, is the idea of an open content license, which is really a license that allows anyone in the world to be able to use and reuse material freely right? In order, as long as they follow some very simple provisions. Let me just ask, how many people know about the Creative Commons? Show of hands. Okay, if you don't, it's really important that you learn about the Creative Commons. I'm going to move over here so I can see my clock. Okay. So just to give you a really brief idea, the idea is to move away from a publication model where authors generate material, right? And then they basically give it away to a publisher by signing a contract. They enter into an engagement where they give away the rights to their work to a publisher in exchange for the publisher offering to distribute the material as widely as they can, to a different model where the author actually retains their copyright. So the author owns their material, and they allow others to access their material by attaching a license to it. And this is just one example of one of these Creative Commons licenses. This is the human readable version. You can see that it allows anyone in the world to reuse a piece of material, to share it, to remix it in any different way, as long as they do the truly academic thing, which is to attribute the originating author of the work, which really, when we think about much of the work that goes on in academics today, that's really the end goal, is attribution rather than monetary reimbursement. But we'll talk more about that towards the end. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense to everybody. This is the human readable version. Here's the lawyer readable version. These licenses have been internationalized to about 80 different countries to date, and a very conservative estimate is about 500 million pieces of art, music, text have been licensed under Creative Commons licenses. Okay, not just by big musical groups, but even by the White House, for example, uses a Creative Commons license for all of the material generated by outside contractors that is not already under the public domain. Okay, so this is really a movement. This openness movement is really something that is gaining a lot of ground both in the scholarly publishing world and also the textbook educational publishing world. So just to summarize everything I've been talking about up to now, this idea of networks of knowledge is trying to move from today's truly pipeline model of publication to really an ecosystem model where we have continual feedback, right, at every stage of the process, from conceptualizing a piece of work to authoring it to editing it to quality control of the final distribution of that material. And the key idea is, since that we can involve a very, very large community of people at each of these layers of development of the material, through all of the different modes of feedback that we have available, we can hopefully drive the quality of the material ever higher, rather than, in this particular model, have simply a gatekeeper type quality control model. And we'll talk a lot more about this later in the talk. Anybody have any questions at this point? Okay, let's talk about some brief examples, and I'm going to focus here on the educational side of things and talk a little bit about scholarly journals, and then we'll move into where things are going. So in the educational world, this what's called the open education movement, which is taking this network of knowledge idea and trying to apply it to textbooks, learning materials, other kinds of resources, is really in the last year and a half started to accelerate at a exponential pace. There are a number of different projects out there. People probably are certainly familiar with MIT OpenCourseWare, which is a project launched about 7 years ago to open up access for people to basically look at many of the curricular materials that are in use at MIT for teaching their various courses. There are a whole bunch of other projects that are out there. I'll be touching on some of these as we go along, but the one that I'll focus on just really briefly is Connections, which is the project started here just over 10 years ago. So Connections was started really as the idea of trying to build a true network of knowledge. The reason it's called Connections is first because it really intends to connect ideas together, to really indicate and show that the linearized presentation of material from a regular textbook or set of lectures is just one particular tour or path through a larger network of knowledge, showing how ideas are really integrated and connected to each other, showing how the mathematics ties into the engineering, ties into the sustainability and other kinds of design issues. Currently, the repository at Rice has about 900 open, you could think of them as textbooks. These are woven from about 15,000 or so of these little 2 or 3 page, what are called modules in the system. Everything's completely free online, and everything is very, very low cost, available very, very low cost in a print format. The second reason it's called Connections is that the true intent was to try to pull people together to connect together and to work on material collaboratively, not exactly necessarily in a Wikipedia type model, but in a collaborative working group type environment to be able to have new efficiencies in the way that material can be developed. Currently, I think we account for something like, Kathy, what is it, 35% of Rice's web traffic, I think. About 1.5 million unique users and 70 million hits per month, basically from every country connected to the internet. So just to give you a sense of who's getting involved in open ed, let's talk about some big institutional investors in this idea. The first is a consortium of community colleges across the United States, about 80 plus of them at last count, who have basically made the realization that textbook costs have risen at such a high rate that in many states the cost of tuition equals the or is less than the cost of books. Cost of books exceeds cost of tuition. So when a student is dropping out in California, right, it's as much the publisher's fault as the state's fault, right? So these community colleges have decided that they would band together and develop a complete set of educational materials, textbooks, if you will, for the top 30 most taken community colleges in the United States. This is the first book that's come out. This is a book on statistics. It's for the Math 1 course in California. I'm going to hand it around. Susan's going to do a test on it, quiz on it later. Basically, that book is completely free online, and it's $31 in print. Okay, about 31 bucks. It's about a factor of 5 cheaper than from a traditional publisher. Second example is the government of Vietnam has realized that they should get involved in networks of knowledge to improve their educational system. Right? They're interested in free and open and connected materials, but even more, they're actually very interested in the fact that tools like Connections enable faculty at diverse and disparate institutions to work together. And so one of their main goals in getting involved in projects of this sort is to try to bring the faculty together to collaboratively develop materials, therefore getting involved in a countrywide faculty development enterprise that will raise the quality of not just the materials, but instruction countrywide. So that's pretty exciting. A project out of South Africa called Siavula that's sponsored by the Shuttleworth Foundation. People might know Mark Shuttleworth. He was the first space tourist, is developing a complete K-12 curriculum for the country of South Africa that is already making inroads into several European countries and into the United States. And the last thing I'll bring up is the IEEE just announced last week, or basically ratified last week, that they'll be getting involved in a large-scale project with Connections to develop and share educational materials in the engineering world. So these are some big sort of institutional investors in this idea of networks of knowledge. Some other examples. Faculty at about 14 universities across the United States had decided about the same time as we started Connections, about 8 or 10 years ago, that they wanted to write a textbook in the area of signal processing, which happens to be my research area. And I ended up meeting all of these people at a conference, and they were thinking about signing contracts to write a signal processing book. And what we realized is that there would be 14 books to add to the already 75 signal processing books, right? Which would basically create, again, a tremendous inefficiency, right? A tremendous waste of everybody's effort. So instead, what we decided to do is band together and create what we call a super textbook for the area of signal processing, which will contain probably about 2,000 or 3,000 pages of material that can then be mined, right, to build a purpose-built book for Rice, Berkeley, Stanford, MIT, where we realize that about 85% of each book will be in common because the curriculum is really in common across all these institutions. But we can just mine from this extra material for all of the customizations and build a textbook that's much more efficient and has hopefully better learning outcomes by working together as a team rather than individually. So that's an example of how these network effects can create more efficiency. Another example is how network effects can create better accessibility. Just very briefly, a number of graduate students at UT El Paso wanted to get involved in the super textbook project. However, they didn't feel comfortable writing new material, so they decided to translate some of the existing material into Spanish. They took one of the books in the signal processing super textbook series, spent a summer translating it. Within a week of publishing it in the Connection system, it was in our top 10 most popular. It remains there today. And just to give you a sense, my particular material in Connections is about 4 times more popular in Spanish than it is in English. Right? And this is something that would really be impossible to achieve under the traditional paper-based textbook publication system, and it's really something that's enabled by these type of interconnectivities and network effects. What I'm much more interested in, though, is the large-scale interconnectivities of people that you never really thought could get involved in projects of this sort. And this is the idea of extending the network of people who are allowed to contribute to a free commons of material from the usual suspects, faculty members at universities, for example, to all comers. And let's just talk about 2 very brief examples. Kitty Schmidt-Jones is a private music teacher in Champaign, Illinois. She teaches 25 students a year. That's how many students she is able to impact every year. Okay? She found out about Connections through her husband and thought, well, wait a minute, there's a whole tremendous number of music teachers, right, all in K-12 institutions all around the world, all around the US in particular, who are basically forced to go out and buy the materials themselves, right, because that's the first thing that gets cut in school budgets. So she said, I'm going to develop a really high quality set of music materials. Not the kind of person who would write a music theory textbook. Sunil Singh is a dad. Right? He's somebody's dad in Delhi, India. He's a geophysical, petrochemical engineer, rather. He was tutoring his kids physics, realized the book was wrong, and what wasn't wrong was poorly explained. Has anybody ever noticed this when they tutor their kids? Right? So he started making handwritten notes, right? Which got photocopied and photocopied and photocopied until he would see them and he couldn't read the photocopies. So he decided to put his material into a system that would let people share their ideas. At last count, these people had millions of uses by people around the world, right? Kitty Schmidt-Jones is becoming a Harry Potter of music theory. And again, these are not the usual kind of people that you would think could contribute extremely high quality educational materials. So the way I like to think about this specifically is that people, you often think of networks, right, as distribution networks. That an institution can have an open, for example, open education project, and the key idea is often about outreach, trying to push our way of teaching out there to the world so that everyone can see how great our institution is. The thing that I'm most excited about with networks of knowledge is not this outreach, it's the inreach. It's letting the Kitty Joneses and the Sunil Singhs actually come into the classroom, right? Come into the educational materials development procedure so that we can have a tremendously increased diversity of ideas and ultimately, I believe, quality of educational ideas. Okay, so I'm very, very excited about this in-reach idea. So let's say some brief words about what's going on in scholarly publication, because I would argue that what's been happening in open education has really been following along an exploding world of open journal and open scientific publication. A large number of open education journals have been launched at last count. The DOAJ had basically over 4,000 open journals that had been registered. Very interestingly, most of these, right, or the largest percentage are in the United States, but a very large number of open journals are being started in developing countries. And when you talk to librarians from these countries, it's very, very clear why these journals are being developed in these developing countries, because of the incredibly high cost to provide non-open journals in these kind of research environments. There are two declarations that I'd like everybody to go have a look at. They're parallel declarations. The first was a declaration about open research and open access journal publication called the Budapest Open Access Initiative. I'd like everybody to take a look at that. You can sign as an individual or as an institution. There's a parallel document called the Cape Town Open Education Declaration that you can also sign as an individual or institution. And the idea of both of these documents is to try to help build momentum and some consensus behind what it really means to be doing open research, open education, and be building one of these networks of knowledge. Any questions at this point before I plow on with the rest? Okay, so let's talk about where, we've talked a little bit about where we are. Hopefully it makes sense to everybody. Let's talk about where things are going sort of imminently and then more longer term in both the worlds of educational and scholarly publishing. The first big thing that's happening is legislation, both in the open access space for science and in the open education space. People might be familiar with the fact that the United States Congress has now realized that medical research is a public good and that access to medical research should be available to all. Right? Not just the people that can afford the journals. So there actually is a mandate that says anyone that has published a paper whose research, the research on which it's based, has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, within 6 months of publishing that paper must be also put into an open access database for perpetual free access to all. Okay? A similar mandate is in place in the UK for the Wellcome Trust, who actually funds most of the healthcare funding in the UK. So this is in the open access space. They're also gurgling, slowly burbling up about similar mandates for NSF, DOE, Department of Energy, DOE, and a number of other agencies. What's happened very recently is the similar parallel kinds of legislation in the education space. So there are a number of states, state of California, Virginia, a number of others, who actually have e-textbook initiatives. The initial idea for a lot, or the initial jumping off point for a lot of these is actually to save money, right? Because open educational materials are free. But a second big idea is to try to use these materials to also drive the steady and improvement of content. Another big initiative is President Obama announced about 3 months ago the AGI, American Graduation Initiative, that will see the DOE, Department of Education, spending about $50 million on an open access curriculum for community colleges, really building on what this consortium built. And it's no surprise because the new Undersecretary of Education is Martha Cantor, who started the Community College Open Textbook Project. Okay, so I think I've had really great hopes for the AGI. There's also a bill that's been introduced called the American Open College Textbook Act by Senator Durbin from Illinois that will in fact parallel this NIH open access mandate to say if you have an NSF grant, a Department of Energy grant, or a grant from a large number of different U.S. granting agencies, and you say in there that you're going to develop educational materials, those materials can be published with a traditional publisher, but they also must be available in a perpetual open access archive, which is, I think, very, very exciting. Sort of jumping ahead of all of these projects is the Dutch WikiWise project that actually is seeing a complete K-12 open access curriculum being developed over the next couple years. Couple to 3 years that will basically replace all of the textbooks that are currently used in the Netherlands with open access educational materials. Okay, very, very exciting project. Okay, so we talk about legislation, right? The second thing people will often think about is where the money is in all of this, right? How are we going to sustain this? It's one thing to say the government will have a mandate, right? But building a network, building the software, building all the resources that's required to connect people and create ideas costs money. So how are we going to sustain these projects out into the future? And so the first question that usually comes to people's minds when they think about open education or open journals is, how are we going to sustain these projects? And indeed, are these networks of knowledge at all sustainable? Right? That's a question that comes to people's minds. And I would say this is a very good question, but it's the wrong question. I think a much more important question is the status quo sustainable? And in there's no question in open science and open textbooks, the status quo is completely unsustainable. Just to give you one statistic, in textbooks, textbook prices have risen 4 times faster than inflation for well over a decade. So what's basically happening is textbook publishers are pricing themselves out of the market. The $400 textbook is just over the horizon. This might not be that much of a problem at a Rice, at a Harvard, but for, again, the 80%, the 90% of students out there in the United States and the 99% around the world, this is rapidly going to exceed the cost of tuition at all of these institutions of higher learning. And so what we're going to see is a market collapse that really is inevitable. So you ask, well, what's going to happen, and how is this going to play out? And I would say that one way to kind of think about where the world of scholarly publishing and textbook publishing is going is just to look at what the internet has done to 3 other worlds, right? 3 other businesses, right? The world of computer hardware and software, what open source software has done there. The world of music. Does anybody here buy CDs? Okay. Anybody here buy LPs? I would say a lot of people here probably buy CDs. Talk to students in your class. Do they buy CDs? I tried to get rid of some CD racks, and I was going to give them away, and no one wanted them, right? It's basically, for anyone under the age of 25, completely electronic distribution is the only way people are getting music. It's completely changed the music business. We'll talk more about this later. And then newspapers. Has anyone noticed that newspapers are in a bit of a problem, right? Do any of you place classified ads, or do you put it on Craigslist? Right? Craigslist has been a force that is a tremendously disruptive force in the world of newspapers. So to think about what's going to happen in the world of, first, let's just begin with talking about textbooks and journals. We only need to look at what's happening in these other worlds. And very much along the idea of network effects and what Susan alluded to at the beginning in the introduction is you just need to realize that educational publishing and journal publishing especially is a very long-tailed business. Okay? When Moshe Vardi publishes a paper, right? Okay, he's hoping, right, to be up here at the Harry Potter end, right, of journal publishing, right? But unfortunately, many of our works end up down here in a long tail. Okay, so everybody here familiar with the long tail? Okay, yeah. So the basic idea is there's lots of money per book at that end. Very, very little money per book at this end. Here we're talking about selling 3, 4, 5 copies of some piece of material every year. Yes, sir?
When I published a book,
yes.
Then I checked its rank in Amazon.
Yes.
Amazon said, people who bought your book also bought Harry Potter.
Really? They did? Wow, that's fabulous. So you are the Harry Potter of computer science theory. I love that. Okay, I'm going to remember that. Okay. So the really important thing is this is totally parallel with what goes on in the music business, that there is a huge amount of effort in the music business catering to the Madonnas and the Bruce Springsteens and trying to sell those records. But in fact, most of the music that we listen to actually lives way out here in the long tail. And the thing Moshe didn't mention is he was actually the bassist for a while in Leningrad Cowboys. Okay, so if you take this to the limit, there's a question of how is this idea of trying to reduce the costs, right, via networks of knowledge to knowledge-based materials can also impact other kinds of industries. So this is an example of what's gone in software, computer hardware and software, music industry, and in newspapers. And there's a fascinating, very a fascinating book by Chris Anderson called Free that you might want to check out, or a Wired Wired magazine article that came out a few months before the book came out that talks about why the whole number of different business scenarios and business cases, why it actually makes sense to make the cost of something $0. Okay, and we could talk about a whole bunch of different examples. One of them being inkjet printers. Okay, this is not $0, but have you ever compared the cost of the printer to the cost of the what? The inkjet cartridges, right? So basically a loss leader for you to get you to buy the printer so that they can hook, HP can hook you to buy the cartridges. Gillette razors, exactly same idea. CDs are actually very, very similar. Okay? The amount of money that most artists make from CD sales is a tiny portion of the amount of money that they make from concerts. So in fact, for many, many, many groups, right, the CD is actually a loss leader to just get people to come to their concerts where they make the large amount of money. And no one understood this better than the Grateful Dead, who would let anyone, everybody thought they were crazy, that they would let anyone bootleg records from their concerts. This is back in the 60s, right? But what they realized is that by getting more people to hear their music, right, basically using bootleg as a free distribution channel for the band, they would get more people to their concerts. And they made an enormous amount of money, okay, enormous amount of money. So this is a very interesting book. As Moshe will point out, though, much more interesting is the dialogue between Chris Anderson and Malcolm Gladwell that got really interesting at times. So I'd highly recommend people check this out. Here's Malcolm in the, just come out of his dojo, ready to pounce on Chris with another point. In fact, some of Malcolm's points are extremely good points. Okay, so let's just briefly, let's talk about some models in which these networks of knowledge can actually work with for-profit entities. This is one possible path to sustainability. And the example is, how does Red Hat work with Red Hat Linux work with Linux software? Let me just ask a quick show of hands. People familiar with Red Hat and or Linux? Okay, very, very briefly. What is Linux? Linux is an operating system, right? Not unlike say Windows. It is a operating system that is completely free, that you could go on the web today and just download and install on your computer. Okay, so it's completely free, and it's actually even better, it's open source. However, how do many big institutional users get Linux? Does Rice download Linux off the internet and install it on our computers? No. In a lot of cases, Rice actually goes out and buys Linux. They buy something free from a company called Red Hat. Okay? Red Hat is a company that exists in a symbiotic relationship with the free Linux software system. And basically what they do is they package up this free software. They put it on some DVDs so that you can install it right now instead of waiting 2 days for the entire kernel to download, right? That's nice. Second, they give you a 1-800 number to call when it doesn't install correctly. And third, they give you someone to blame, right, when it doesn't install correctly. So they actually add significant value to the Linux software system. And in fact, thinking about this network that they are a part of, at one point in time, more than Red Hat as a company employed more than 1/2 of all people programming the Linux software system. Right, so this is a company who realized that they needed to work in this symbiotic relationship with all the other developers around the world, and they were devoting their company's resources to making the software system better, okay? This open source system. Okay, so that's one example in the software world. Their revenues are $360 million a year. They're a very profitable company, and the entire Linux software market of for-profit companies is about a $3 billion market. Okay, this is $3 billion built around stuff that's completely free. Okay, a lot of people making money. Here's a company that you might have heard about that's trying to do a very similar thing with open publication for textbooks. It's a company called Flat World Knowledge, and they also aim to build value-added services, if you will, around a set of open resources. So their business model is that they have a number of textbooks. They're primarily working in the business school textbooks today. The books are completely free online. They're extremely low in cost, in print rather, about $20 or $30. Okay? So they make very, very little money from each print book. But their model is actually to sell services around the book. Flashcards, QA, linking with tutors, etc. Okay? And their basic, the premise of their whole business is that they will make a lot more money from these services around the book, very much like people going to concerts, right, in the music world, than from the actual books themselves. Time will tell, but it's a very, very interesting model. Another interesting model is using open access and these networks as a way to try to rescue the crisis of university presses. Okay, over 60 university presses have either closed or been completely restructured in about the last decade. Rice actually closed its press in 1996. And as an experiment, Rice actually reopened its university press in 2007 as a new kind of, under a new kind of model, a hybrid model, where the front end of the press is just like a regular university press with a editor-in-chief, an editorial board that solicit manuscripts. But then once the manuscripts come through the regular editorial review process, they're actually, all the back end is handled through connections. Right? So their bookstore, if you will, is actually all handled through connections, and all of their books are completely free online and available at very low cost in print. Okay, the idea here is that the hope is that using this hybrid model can reduce the costs of running a university press to a level such that more universities can afford to either keep them open or to reopen them. Okay, so this all brings us to the editorial process and quality control. Because what we've done here somehow, by opening up the ability for anyone to contribute to this, these networks of knowledge, is we've really moved the bottleneck. Right? We've moved the bottleneck from publication. Right? The distribution bottleneck used to be getting things into paper, getting it into people's hands. Now that's easy. Now the bottleneck is figuring out if it's any good, right? And trying to keep the potentially bad stuff out of harm's way. So let's tell a quick story. So it didn't take long after Connections started back in 1999 for some interesting material to show up on lingerie. And we actually took it down. We didn't take it down because it was risque. In fact, it was very high quality. It was actually a paper about the history of lingerie. We took it down because it was plagiarized, right? And it was plagiarized because Dico Bourse, right, this enterprising young guy, decided that he would post this material that was plagiarized from a journal in France, a Postmodernist Journal in France, just so that he would be able to get some people to click on Course website so he could sell them some lingerie. Right? So the idea is, how are we going to... This is clearly not what we want people looking at. So clearly, we need to think a little bit about how we can control the quality of the material in this network. And the standard way to deal with this is peer review, right? And the problem is that, as I said before, is that we're basically now, if we adopt a regular kind of peer review model for these networks of knowledge, we're basically moving the bottleneck from production to peer review. Okay? The number, unless people hadn't noticed, the peer review system is on the verge of collapse. Has anybody noticed that? Anybody here an editor of a journal? The number, just an informal survey of a number of my colleagues, the number of scholarly articles that I'm requested to review every year has grown in the last 5 years by about a factor of 8. Okay, I cannot review all these manuscripts, right? So what has resulted is longer publication times. It takes 3 years to get a paper out in the journal that I publish in. Very often the technique is obsolete by the time it comes out. Okay, and as a result, what's happened is increasingly people are moving completely around the journals to just completely open publication on their own websites. And so the question then is how, really two questions. The first is, peer review is an extremely exclusive system that actually completely cuts across the idea of open access and an open standard. So we really want to move towards something that's more community-based or inclusive. The second problem, though, is no matter what you do, the current ways that we do peer review can't keep up with all of these materials. And now multiply by many factors the peer review of not just scholarly materials, but educational materials, other kinds of materials, and the fact that these materials being electronically produced can change over time. They become malleable objects. So we have to have a system that's not just inclusive, but also scalable. And so I'm going to talk about just one particular model that we've actually adopted here at Rice to try to bring both a system of inclusivity and scalability to peer review. And the idea is to exploit what's called social software, which is, again, exploit a network of individuals, entities, organizations to farm out the process of review to a larger community of users. So let's just illustrate. Here's a repository of open materials. Some of it's really good. Some of it's really bad or incorrect. Some of it is just inappropriate, right? Some of it's just inappropriate. So the idea of a lens is to build a layer around this repository, right? On a layer that can be controlled by arbitrary third parties. So for example, a professional society like the IEEE can approach Connections and say, we would like to start doing peer review of your materials in electrical engineering because we think it's an important educational outreach element of our society. And so what they can do is have a lens. And the idea is when you go to now IEEE.org/CNX, you will not see this entire repository. You will just see the part that has been reviewed and selected by the IEEE. Okay, the key thing, though, is that there can be an arbitrary number of these lenses. There will be a Rice lens, right, that will contain all of the material in Connections, for example, that's used at Rice. There will be individual. Sydney could have his own lens, right? This is all the stuff I think is great. Probably just point to his own stuff, right? But the idea is by enabling arbitrary third parties to get involved in review and peer review of these materials, peer review in all of its different forms, we can have a system that's much, much more scalable. So just an example, let's say you searched for some technical topic in Google, you ended up on this Connections module, you wonder, is this any good? You have no idea. But if you go over into this panel over here, you see that this has actually been reviewed by an organization, in this case a company called National Instruments. And so if you click on that, it actually tells you, well, who is NI? How did they review this material? What was their process? And for example, who are their reviewers? What's their procedure? And then a list of all of the other material that has been included in their lens. So the idea is to think of this very similarly to how a university, like a press or a journal would organize their material, but enable it to be much, much more malleable and scalable. A whole bunch of different organizations are developing lenses, and I think I already mentioned the IEEE is coming soon. So I have about 2-3 minutes left, right? So I just like to talk more longer term about where some of these ideas might be pushing us, right? And again, think about computer software 15 years ago. Think of the music industry 15 years ago. Think about the newspaper industry 15 years ago and how different they are today. And now think about textbooks, scholarly publications, where they are today and where they might be 15 years from now. And let's even think about our institutions and where they are today and where they might be 15 years from now. So let's talk about the two hallmarks that I really tried to bring up when I talked about education in particular are disintermediation and disaggregation. What is disintermediation? It's cut out the middleman. Okay, it's Craigslist. Don't post an ad, pay to the Houston Chronicle to post an ad. Just go straight to this website and talk directly to someone who wants to buy your end table, right? So this is very, very important a thing that is enabled by the internet and by these networks. The second is disaggregation. The fact that networks allow us to break apart what were previously pipelines, for example, publishing pipelines, and spread the pieces into entities where the overall product is more efficient, right? Disaggregating a business, for example. So you might ask, this is no question, this is happening and will happen in textbooks and in scholarly journal publication. I am convinced, at least. So then you might ask, on a bigger question, could this happen to schools? Could this happen to colleges? Right? And I personally feel that's, again, not the right question. It's like, when will this happen? Right? To schools and to colleges and to universities. And it might never happen to Rice. Might never happen to Harvard. But no question in my mind, there are very large changes happening in this tail of 80 to 90% of the educational institutions in this country. Right? They are under tremendous market forces today, thanks to the disintermediating and disaggregating forces of these networks of knowledge. So just two examples. First, disintermediation. Okay? We think of the university, the school, as a place where people come together, right, to work together and work in one place with a faculty member to learn, right? Okay, well, here's an example. Pushing open textbooks to the limit. University of the People, founded by the United Nations, right, that actually aims now to say there are open educational materials, but we're going to start to offer actual courses around these materials with actual degrees. We're actually going to credential these courses so that you will be able to get a degree in economics from the University of the People. What's the tuition? It's basically free, okay? But it's basically, you could get an entire degree for under $1,000, okay? And they're relying on some very experimental ideas. I'm not saying this is the way everything will be in the future, but they're relying on peer sort of tutoring. They're relying on open educational materials. But I think we just need to keep in mind what's going to happen to our institutions. The second is aggregation. Right? We talk about publishing as a very aggregated thing, right? Authors kind of go in one end and books come out the other end of this grinder, right? Well, what are universities, right? But we matriculate students and then we spit out graduates. Now, we are extremely efficient machines that generate extremely great graduates, right? But there is no question in my mind that, again, in this long tail, for this 80% of schools and universities and colleges, this is going to be disaggregated, right? And there is no question that, well, there are, again, universities out there that are just on the verge of basically trying to move into offering courses inside other institutions, trying to move towards credit from different institutions being able to transfer even much more easily. The Bologna Accord in Europe is just a beginning of this. And I think it's really, as we think about Rice and where we're moving in this second century, it's not clear, I'm not saying this is going to happen to Rice, but I think we need to be very, very clear about what's going to be happening to other institutions around the world and how we need to sort of surf on this wave to always keep ourselves, for example, at the very, very forefront. Okay, so I think it's clear that there are lots of opportunities, both on the outreach side of building networks of knowledge, but also on this inreach side of welcoming a more diverse community into our own institutions to present more allow more diversity and also higher quality information through community involvement, and trying to build, again, this idea of a network of knowledge being truly an ecosystem where we're constantly trying to improve the quality and accessibility of our materials. I think as I end, I'd just like to say everybody should get involved, right? Start an open journal. Moshe has already done that. Adopt an open textbook for your course. Contribute your knowledge. Everyone here not only has something to learn, but everyone here has something to teach. And teach not just your students using open materials, but also educating your colleagues about this world of open access. Okay, so I think I'll end there, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I think there's time for a few questions. And let me just get a mic up to you, Paul.
You could maybe do the first, and I can repeat if it's...
Okay.
So it seems that one of the obstacles to getting people involved is promotion and tenure review.
Exactly.
Doesn't give the same weight or credit to contributing to connections, for example, as a book. And I don't know how we overcome that.
So I have three answers to that.
Supposed to repeat the question.
Oh yeah, thank you. The question is, one of the problems with open access, at least to date, has been that the materials aren't viewed as having the same weight or import when it comes to promotion and tenure. Okay, so I'll just give you a few feelings, and I would agree. I would give you a few feelings. The first is there are an increasing number of deans and chairs who are starting to realize that open access should be on a higher footing. That's part one. Part two, what's happening in the scholarly publishing world is really people are having their cake and eat it too. For example, if I submit a paper to the IEEE Transactions on Information Theory, which is a standard journal of very high impact factor, as soon as I'm submitting that paper to that journal, it is submitted or can be submitted directly to arXiv. So in fact, my paper is living two parallel lives, right? And it is available open access through the arXiv, and it's also under peer review. And as soon as, if my paper is accepted, it's still available in the arXiv with basically a lens, a stamp on it saying it has been reviewed by IEEE Transactions on Information Theory. So that's an example where people can really have it both ways. The final answer I would just say is that at most Tier 1 research universities, sadly, educational materials don't count for much anyway in promotion and tenure, if we really want to be sort of crass about it. It's really research results. And so I would argue that if you can demonstrate even a much larger global impact with your open access materials than a book published by, say, Cambridge University Press, it might end up having more weight than you really realize. Does that help? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Vivek.
So how should we be training our students differently for this new world of networks of knowledge? For example, do students have to learn to promote themselves more? It's not quite American Idol, but it's halfway there.
Yeah, interesting. So the question is, how should we be training the new generation of students? I think there's, again, two answers to that question. The first is, I think they're training us as much as we're training them, because I think they have a much better handle on electronic means for publication and promotion than a lot of faculty members do. And so I think that they're actually helping a lot of faculty members, actually helping to drag them into the internet age. But I do think that as the new mechanisms for promotion of your ideas, right, either through open journals or open educational resources come along, for example, peer review opportunities, opportunities for developing materials in new areas to get the first mover advantage, I think it's really important as faculty members that we involve our students if we're involved in an open education project, so they can then take it to their institution after they graduate and build that community. So.
I wonder if there's anybody working on using these ideas to change our form of government.
Interesting.
We may look at the small groups of town hall meetings, and it seems that we have the opportunity to go back in that sense to what's required now. Because if you look at the healthcare debates and so on, you immediately see that what we have is nonsense. You see the main, all sorts of things being ignored.
Yeah, so the question is, that could these ideas impinge on even how we do government? And I would say absolutely. And in fact, there are a whole number of projects who are actually looking exactly at this question. And you might check out the Berkman Center at Harvard University. And they have a number of fellows who are working on exactly this idea. Moshe.
So you mentioned different ways that businesses can exist in this freenomical world. What about connections? What's the business model for connections?
So for connections in particular, there's a number of axes to the business model. One is print publication. That even though free electronic publication is our forte and our core business, there are a lot of people out there who still want print, and print is going to be around for quite a while. And so part of the business model is every book that's actually printed through Connections, there's a small percentage that actually comes back as a mission support fee to the project. And when you think about the fact that in this community college textbook project, if we're selling, or if hundreds of thousands of books are being used per semester, and even 10% of those of people are buying paper copies, that can add up to a fairly substantial amount of money. The second is the Connections has actually built a consortium and is moving the software development of the software platform into a consortium model where about 10 or 15 organizations, universities, companies, professional societies have joined on as similar to the World Wide Web Consortium to determine the future developments for the software platform. Kathy, why don't you?
I just got back from South Africa with this group that has done K-12 curriculum for South Africa. And they are building a print business model around their materials because print is incredibly important in Africa right now. You just don't have the internet connectivity to be able to distribute materials without having a print mechanism. So they're building a print aggregation service, and then they'll take a small cut off that. So it not only gets low-cost materials widely spread, but it is a way to sustain the whole process of getting these open educational materials developed and distributed. Very interesting to look at what they're doing too.
Sure.
Is there one last question?
I think so.
But I was wondering if there isn't odd that the business model relies on a format that is actually the opposite of what the real thing actually is. Isn't there some
Like an irony there? I would say, yeah, no question. There's an irony. I think long term, I view the paper as a medium term, short and medium term solution, and the consortium really is the long term solution for sustaining the project.
Or a concert series.
Or a concert series, exactly. Sydney's actually started a band, and yeah, Jason.
I think you kind of made the point before that a lot of companies could sell services around
Yes.
the materials themselves. So it might not be the selling of the material that makes you money, but adding all this additional value that makes it useful.
Yeah, exactly. And you could even imagine that a software platform like Connections just becomes sort of either an official or de facto global standard, and then essentially kind of almost disappears, because it's just the fabric on which people are building these networks. Kathy, you were going to add, or?
Well, I was just going to say that there are some companies looking at providing services to help students find each other as they're working through materials in Connections and other open source areas, and also in tutoring and things like that. So we're seeing interest from businesses.
All right, well, let me call this to a halt now so that we can go out and continue the conversation over the reception, but I do want to thank Rich for delivering a marvelous and highly provocative talk.
Thank you.
I mean, I always feel when Rich talks that I'm getting a very privileged look over the edge of some kind of potentially marvelous cliff. I'm reminded that the last time the political economy of knowledge was so changed was when Gutenberg did it. And not all of the repercussions were pleasant for the people at the time. So we clearly have some transformations ahead of us, but it is a most exciting project. I did want to suggest that if there are people in the audience who want more information on connections and perhaps being a connections author, I'm going to put a sheet outside where you can put your email address. Sydney Burrows has kindly volunteered to take this list and get in touch with you. If there's enough interest, we might contemplate running a workshop for potential connections authors, for people who don't know the platform and would just like to familiarize themselves before jumping in. So we'll do that. And with that, I would like to welcome you to come out to our reception, come to our next talk in January. This will be Leonardo Dueñas-Osario talking about critical infrastructure networks. He's from our own Department of Environmental Engineering. I did forget to tell you who I was. Those of you who don't know, I'm Susan McIntosh. I direct Scientia, and I am glad to see all of you here today and welcome you to the reception and to our programs next semester. Thanks very much to you all for coming, and to Rich again. Thank you.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.